Well, welcome. My name's David Hall, and as a trustee, I'm delighted to welcome you to Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, which, as many of you know, is celebrating its bicentenary this year. Before I start, I need to say that we're not expecting a fire practice, so if there is an alarm, it's for real, and can we go down the stairs and out into the square to stay out of the way of the fire brigade. Now, for Heritage Open Days, we planned a series of sample sessions which will let people know what it is that we do here. Many of you will be familiar, but for those who don't, we have a program of live events, mainly talks, but other artistic performances as well, and all at very moderate prices. But today's event is free, as are all our daytime events this week for Heritage Open Days. This is to make sure that people can have a chance to sample what we have on offer without price being a barrier. But I would like to say that we're an educational charity. We get no support for our running costs from government or the local council. So if any of you feel that you would like to make a donation on your way out, there is a machine you can wave your debit card at as you leave the building, or if you'd like to become a member, there are forms at reception on the ground floor. So do have a go if you'd like to. Now, for today's Heritage Open Day event, we're very lucky to have Dr. Amy Frost to speak to us. I know she's just come from delivering another talk at lunchtime. So when we were founded 200 years ago, the paintings above you were by Andrea Casali, were donated to us. They're very much part of our heritage, and we're delighted to have someone as expert as Amy to tell us all about where they're from, the artist, and his patron. Delightfully, we have two further Casalis on loan from the Holborn Museum, for which we are extremely grateful, the two on the wall, which are with us for 2 months. Now, Amy's subject is the Italian artist Andrea Casali and his work for Alderman William Beckford at Fonthill Splendens in Wiltshire, which is where all these paintings are from. Now, Amy, as I'm sure most of you know, is the senior curator at Bath Preservation Trust, which looks after No. 1 Royal Crescent, the Museum of Bath Architecture, the Herschel Museum of Astronomy, and also very relevant for today, Beckford's Tower up on the skyline above Bath. So she's also an architectural historian and a leading expert on the Beckfords, father and son. So I'll hand over to Amy. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to David for inviting me to talk. I can't remember when it was, but probably about 16 years ago, maybe, the pictures were restored. And I stood here talking about them, but only for about 10 minutes. So it's nice to be able to come and give them more space and give Casali's story more space as well. And in particular, to be looking at William Beckford the Elder, so Alderman William Beckford, and his art collecting and his picture collecting and his decorative collecting for the house that he built, which makes a nice change from talking about the younger William Beckford and his work. And to start really by putting a few ideas in place about, particularly if we look at these paintings and the idea of ceiling paintings and decorative painting that is part of an interior scheme. And the difference there is with what's, let's call, an easel painting, so a painting that's going to be hung on the wall, is smaller in scale, and those that are expressly created to be seen like this, to be quite high up. I mean, these are practically sitting on top of us, so you've got to imagine like twice the height, if not more, where you'd be looking at them, and how that fits with the idea of primarily the country houses that they're being designed for. And it's really important to bear that in mind, particularly with someone like Alderman Beckford, whose country house that he creates at Fonthill is an extension of his social status and an extension of the power that he wields in British society. And that's an immense power, and that's an immense power that has made possible because of an obscene amount of wealth that he gained through the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved African people. And that money gave him political power, it gave him social power, But it meant that for someone who'd come from trade, building a new country house, but also decorating that country house was fundamental to showing your place in society and for showing your power. And this kind of decorative scheme, particularly when it's a decorative scheme that's been commissioned just for that place, so it hasn't been bought in from somewhere else, it's been created for that place as that place is being built, is very tied up in the story about the person or the man, it's always the man at this time, the man who owns that building and who's building that building is trying to project. So there's a level of myth making in both the building, but in also the decorative scheme that goes on inside. And the work that Andrea Casali does for Alderman Beckford is primarily allegorical scenes. They're called history paintings, but they're allegorical scenes by and large, or mythological scenes. So that idea of myth making is something to kind of think about in terms of Alderman Beckford creating his own myth in a way, or what I often kind of think of as the brand, the Beckford brand. So Andrea Casali was born on the 17th of November, 1705 in Rome. And he studied under, sorry, you can't quite see his dates, but he died in 1784. He studied in Rome under two artists in particular, Francesco Trevisani, and you can see one of his works on the left, that's currently at Temple Newsome House, part of the Leeds Museums and Galleries Service. And then also under Sebastiano Conca, and you can see one of his works on the right. And this is really important. He's studying and he's learning under two painters who are history painters, who are doing big religious schemes for churches in Rome. So he's learning this kind of decorative painting, but really also getting a sense of figurative painting. And for the beginning of his career, that's what he's doing. So 1723 to about 38, he is primarily a decorative artist in churches in Rome. And in 1729, he's made a Knight of the Golden Spur for the work that he did on the church of San Sisto Vecchio, which is actually a cloister. So there's the walls of one of the cloisters is a whole gallery which depicts the life of St. Dominic, and that's the work by Casali. So in Italy, in Rome, he is making a name for himself, and a name for himself as a young and respected decorative painter for churches. He goes to Madrid for about 6 months between 1735 and 1736, and then by 1738 he's back in Rome. And what he then starts doing is taking advantage of the grand tourist. And he starts to be commissioned to do what we call grand tour portraits. So particularly when British travellers in Rome doing the grand tour, so effectively men completing their education by spending time travelling in Europe, primarily in Rome, and who are sitting for portraits at that time by an Italian artist. So one of the kind of leading artists of the time was Pompeo Battoni. And there is an element of kind of Battoni style in Casali's grand tour pictures. And here are some examples of them at that time. So on the left, Sir Charles Frederick, now in the Ashmolean. And of course, what you can see over his shoulder is the Pantheon. So it's really locating him in Rome. And that idea, how portraiture is very much about image making in itself anyway. Here is an image making of I am wealthy, I am cultured, I am learned, I went on the grand tour, and just to really hammer that home, you can see, the best piece of architecture from antiquity over my shoulder. So this idea of kind of creating or image making that portraiture does is something that Casali was very au fait with and actually very competent at this time. Very unusual grand tour portrait is the one that you can see in the middle. Mrs. Smart, surname that I can't pronounce, which is in the Newham archives. Highly unusual female grand tour portrait. There are some, but there are not many. And also depicting her with a monument of antiquity over her shoulder. And through some connection to her, probably the black and white picture, of which it's the only image that really survives, the original painting hasn't been located for quite some time, of a member of the Sloper family. Again, with, I want to say it's the Arch of Trajan over his shoulder. But in these very kind of formal, very kind of bread and butter grand tour kind of portrait style. And it's through this work that he gets the kind of invitation or the persuasion to come and work in England. Through the kind of grand tourist network, Casali's wife dies in 1741, and he's encouraged by the Earl of Carlisle to come to England and to apply his trade here. And by 1743, he has a very significant commission, which is for Lord Castlemaine at Wanstead House. So on the left is the version of Wanstead House that was the one that was actually built without the cupola on top of the main building. Wanstead House by Colin Campbell is the model English country house of the Palladian movement. And particularly following the publication of this engraving in Vitruvius Britannicus in 1715, it becomes the kind of the country house format that other houses get based on. And we are kind of, if we were all to turn and look out the window and in a few months' time the leaves had gone, we'd be seeing a version of it. So Wanstead House is what John would base the design for the North Range of Queen Square on, although he made his columns 1.5 inches in diameter bigger just to make them that little bit better. So this is a really important commission, and Casali is commissioned for Wanstead to do 6 history paintings, including the one that you can see on the right, Coriolanus, now at Burton Constable. And this gives you a flavour of his history painting style. And of course, history painting at this time is one of the kind of pinnacles of art. It is very much seen as what the great artists are doing. So it's really placing him within the climate of the mid-18th century artist. And through these kind of commissions, and increasingly as he moves into the 1750s, he is moving in the circle of other artists. He is moving in the circle particularly of Hogarth, and in the circle of Robert Adam. So he is acquainted with both of those characters, and that's really important for his relationship with Alderman Beckford. What he also gets commissioned to do is 4 full-length portraits for the Duke of Ancaster, of the Duke of Ancaster's children. But he also paints a portrait of the Duke of Ancaster's daughter's husband, who was Francis Beckford. And Francis Beckford was Alderman William Beckford's youngest brother. So there is a Beckford connection through these commissions. It's not Ancaster's son-in-law, he's his brother-in-law, sorry. Francis Beckford marries the Duke of Ancaster's sister. I couldn't find those pictures though, I'm afraid, so I haven't shown them. So what I've got is a picture by Reynolds of Francis Beckford. But you know, so the Casali would have been similar, but not as good as this one. And then this connection with Hogarth is quite important, because in 1750, Casali paints this painting, The Adoration of the Magi, and gifts it to Hogarth for the Foundling Museum. So this was to be a kind of like an altarpiece for the chapel of the Foundling Museum, although it later then got removed. And this connection with Hogarth is quite important because it really places him within the artistic circle of London at the time. But also because Hogarth is an artist that Alderman William Beckford collects, and possibly collects through Casali, because Casali is also dealing in pictures, not just painting them, selling them and being commissioned to do them. He's also dealing for probably a lot of those grand tourists that he'd met. So it's probable that this kind of, possibly the Alderman Beckford's acquisition of both the Rake's Progress and the Harlot's Progress was somehow connected, possibly, but I haven't found any proof of that yet, through Casali. And he also then is doing further big commissions for some of the kind of, these are like the rock star country houses of the Palladian movement. So you've got Wanstead, and now you've got Hokum, designed by William Kent. And in 1758, Casali is commissioned by the Earl of Leicester to paint 5 full-length portraits. I mean, that's the most expensive portrait that you could buy. 9 full-length portraits and 2 head and shoulder portraits, for which he's paid £300. And that includes a pair of the Earl of Leicester and his wife, so Margaret and Richard, full length in their ermine robes, having been elevated to the earldom. Sorry, the date is wrong on this. It should say 1758. Having been elevated to earldom in 1753. Interestingly, the other paintings that he's painting of the 9 full length are of people not living. So he is commissioned to paint a portrait of Edward Viscount Coke, who had died at this point. And Casali is, and there are 4, I think, that we know of, other examples of this, where the full-length portrait is at Hokum, and there is a portrait miniature or another portrait done during life of that sitter that Casali has used to create the new version. And of course, what they're doing is commissioning a series of paintings for a specific space within the hall to be the gallery of their family's history. The kind of lost hope of the family's history. And if you can just see, you can see Hokum in the background, really placing him as the heir that never was. There is also a much earlier member of the family depicted in sort of quite buccaneering clothes. And this is quite interesting because it's exactly the same as what the younger William Beckford does. He commissions posthumous portraits of his grandfather and his great-grandfather to hang at Fonthill, like this kind of gallery of ancestors, because their family is not old enough to actually have sat for portraits 100 years before, 200 years before. And that's that myth-making, that's that creation of identity. You have these portraits painted, you hang them in a public space in your impressive newly designed house, and it's about showing your family's place in history, even if you're actually making that history up. And that's fundamental to these nouveau riche, and particularly fundamental to the men who are creating this incredible wealth through the subjugation of enslaved people and colonizing other places. It's a real part of that kind of identity making of the imperial kind of project. And that brings us to Alderman Beckford. So Alderman Beckford, the second son of Peter Beckford, inherits in 1735 when his elder brother dies. Comes back to England having made an immense amount of wealth through transatlantic slavery, and buys his way into politics. So by 1753, he's Sheriff of London. By 1763, he's Lord Mayor of London, and he's Lord Mayor of London again in 1769 into 1770, the first time ever you had the same person Lord Mayor within 10 years. So very powerful, very wealthy. And embarks on his myth-making, his identity project through building. In 1744, he buys the Fonthill estate in Wiltshire, which had a rich history and a particularly important history through the Cottingham family, through the Mervyn family, with a relationship to the crown. And what the earliest house, one of the earlier houses looked like this. This is what Alderman Beckford purchased. And then he makes alterations. He puts a Palladian elevation on it. He adds some wings, and you can just see up over on the hill a little temple, like a banqueting house that he adds. He also creates that 5-arch bridge, rediverts part of the river, creates a lake. And this is the house that in 1755 burnt down. And the Fonthill fire at the time was quite infamous. And the loss of art at that time was quite significant. So this is the fire in which Hogarth's Harlot's Progress was destroyed, which is why we only know the Harlot's Progress through engravings and not through paintings. And quite a few other artworks destroyed it at the same time. And what Alderman Beckford does, largely because he's made a very advantageous marriage in 1746 by marrying into the family of the Duke of Hamilton. This is his wife, Maria Hamilton, who was a widow who had previously been married to another plantation owner in the West Indies. So he gets that respectability through marriage. He gets power through politics, and he gets the appearance of power through the ownership of land, through the owning of this estate. And what he does then is builds a new house, Fonthill House, which is begun in around 1755, takes about 14 years to build, is by and large finished by 1765-66, but not quite like finished completely inside. So the interiors in particular are being fitted out from about 1760, 1761. And that's important for the dating of all these pictures. Very typical mid-18th century Palladian mansion. This is it in Vitruvius Botanicus. Central mansion with a 4-columned projecting portico on the principal front, and with these curved wings, colonnades going to separate kind of wing pavilions. This is the rear elevation. Actually, if you think that this is being built really from about 1759, 1761, that period, the bulk of the house, quite old-fashioned for that time. If you think that this is when Robert Adam or the ideas of Adam is starting to kind of develop, and these kind of heavy keystones that you see around the windows on the first floor that's quite James Gibbs. That's very sort of 1740s, 1745. So it's a little bit old-fashioned, but would have been seen as a modern house if you read an account of it. So this is the house that Casali is commissioned to work in. And Casali receives extensive commissions from Alderman Beckford. He's probably Casali's principal patron in terms of the volume of art that he's commissioned to do, but also the volume of art that Alderman Beckford then acquires from him. So he doesn't just commission them, he also acquires from Casali's sale. So in 1766, Casali sells his stock because he's returning to Italy, and the Alderman acquires at that auction as well. And Casali probably advised the Alderman on his picture collection, and possibly on some of the decorative scheme, because he's being commissioned to design these decorative interiors. And we know that the Alderman is buying other works. So at Fonthill, like I said, it's mainly mythological and allegorical works on the principal floors, and some portraits, although we only have one image of one of those portraits that we now know about. And like I said, it's possible that Adam might have recommended Casali. Casali would have been known to the Alderman because his peers would have also been commissioning him. The status that Alderman had politically, he would have known about that Leicester Commission, he would have known about other things. So there's social and political connections, and it's possibly through his younger brother, through Francis. And to give you an idea of the house, this is the ground floor. So this isn't the principal floor, this is the ground floor. And in particular, the space marked D, which is the Great Hall. And the Great Hall at Fonthill, half of the Great Hall was a double height space. And that becomes important because that double height space is where we start to see some of the Casalis appear. What often gets referred to as the organ hall, because like the ground floor, the back of the hall, was where a huge organ by Krang was. So it took up a substantial part of the hall. And to give you two descriptions from the younger William Beckford's time, but because that's where most of the descriptions we have of the house come from, it kind of sets the scene. So in 1791, Reverend Pocock visits Fonthill, and he records that visit in his journal. And he says, the house is in every respect grand, and Casali has contributed much to its embellishments by his numerous pictures. So there is enough of it that he's named, and the Pocock extract is actually quite small. So, this is a significant painter in this person's eyes. By 1801, when John Britton is visiting for writing The Beauties of Wiltshire, of the organ hall, what you get in Britton's description, and Britton's description is one of the most important for recording this building. So in the organ hall, he says, the ceiling painted by Casali is a proof of the wretched state of the arts about 40 years ago. So not only is the house slightly old-fashioned, even when it's being built, so is Casali. And that's important because this is the Alderman Beckford's collecting, and it is very, very different to his son's collecting in terms of getting artists who are at the vanguard of stylistic change. So we're going to do a tour through the house. And as we tour through the house, we're going to locate the Casalis that we know about. And we know about these pictures from a mixture of first-hand accounts. So we've had Britton, we've had Pocock. There's also someone called Mrs. Lipowis. I mean, I have pages and pages and pages of visits to this house, some of which describe in detail, some of which just refer to ceiling paintings. And by drawing those all together and then reading them alongside sale catalogues, and in particular the 1801 sale catalogue of Fonthill House and the 1807 sale catalogue of Fonthill House, we can actually locate the paintings and we know how many there were. So in the hall, sorry, the red box is in the wrong place. Ignore the red box. What we're looking at is letter A. In the hall, in 1801, lot 60 was an historical picture over the chimney by Casali. And this is the most frustrating thing. Most of the time, it just says historical picture by Casali. Occasionally, it will tell you exactly what it depicts. And that tends to suggest it's a better picture, because the person recording it or the auctioneer recording it is highlighting what scene the picture depicts because it's going to sell better. So it's and that's very interesting kind of insight into how the dealers kind of were working as well. So that's the hall on the ground floor. We're now looking at the principal floor, so the piano nobile, the most important floor of the country house, where all the state rooms were. And the majority of the Casali paintings were in the state rooms at Fonthill. So they were very much designed into the decorative scheme as this house was being built. So, so we've had the organ hall, which is now in red. And then in the tapestry room, which is called the tapestry room, certainly in 1801, and then by the 1807 sale, it's written as the music room. We have one of the earliest descriptions of surviving of the house, which is by Alderman Beckford's stepdaughter, Maria Marsh. And her account from 1768 gives us a lot of information about the inside of the house. And she refers to the tapestry room in 1768 as having Apollo and the Muses in it. Then letter D, the state dressing room. In 1768, she records an excellent portrait of my brother in an oval of elegant ornamental glass. Casali has taken the strongest resemblance of my brother, and it is a sweet and pretty picture, which has damned this painting for its entire kind of existence as being the kind of chocolate box Beckford portrait. So this is the younger William Beckford, the builder of the tower here in Bath, when he is about 6. When he's older, he refers to it as sort of showing his early affinity with nature. So, you know, even as a young man, he's sort of got this bird, you know, his affinity with nature. And this is the only surviving Beckford portrait by Casali that's whereabouts we currently know about, and the earliest known portrait of the heir apparent, because of course you're going to have your heir painted. Alderman Beckford at this time has 2 illegitimate families. He openly acknowledges illegitimate children, but this is his only legitimate heir. So he is going to have portraits of him made to hang in that kind of family history gallery within the house. And at the same time, in 1801, in the same room, a painting on the ceiling of Diana by Casali. And remember that, because that will come up again, because in 1801, that was bought by Mr. Evil, who we will hear more of later. So then we get what was called the blue staircase. So this is the blue staircase on the principal floor, the first floor, going up to the blue staircase, which is the plan on the top, which is of the attic story, in red with the letter J. And the blue staircase was a top-lit, double-height staircase. And what we are told in letter J is that it was filled with large-scale classical paintings by Casali. And importantly, you might just see, it's quite hard to see, but the walls of that room aren't flat. So the kind of interior architecture of that space would be reflecting the shape of the ceiling. So you get a sense of, that's probably history paintings on the walls, possibly a couple in the ceiling, with then the top light, the kind of cupola in the middle. And then off that, the corridor K, is really important, because corridor K is where all of those a lot of those family portraits were hung. It's also where there was a series of portraits of Fonthill House. So you also had portraits done of your house. And that was big business for artists. And that was, again, part of that kind of myth making, that identity making. You depict your house because you are wealthy enough to show it in its land, because the ownership of land is still the symbol of power. And that's important, because that then becomes the corridor that the younger William Beckford has the architect John Soane designed to turn into a top-lit picture gallery, which for the picture geeks amongst you is the first time that Soane ever uses the pendentive dome, and was very influential on Soane's designs for Dulwich Picture Gallery. So those are the kind of like a handful of them. Oh, there's the corridor, sorry. So you can see this, how this interior architecture suggests like pilasters, so that the movement in the room or the shape of the room would have been reflected in the shape of the ceiling. And you can kind of read that on some of these architectural plans where you see projections and recessions rather than flat walls. So the Alderman is collecting pictures. He purchases at auction, and he particularly purchases at auction in the 1740s and 1750s, as he is... Sorry, I'm just trying to get my watch so that I don't overrun. As he is planning Fonthill House and decorating Fonthill House, and then building the new one after the fire. The records we have of what he buys at auction, he's mostly buying Dutch and Flemish landscapes, which is very typical of the time, some Italian, and a few that we know about. So we know that he acquired at an auction this painting, now originally thought to be by Elsheimer and now after, of Tobias and the Archangel, which is now in the National Gallery, and a painting that his son kept. So his son actually didn't dispose of this one, which suggests he actually liked this one. And he also interestingly owned a couple of Watteaus, which is a very different style entirely to kind of these Italians and these history paintings. And this is one that's now in Washington, in the National Gallery in Washington. And then the rest is just Casali's wall-to-wall everywhere. And like I said, it's very, very frustrating because they're not all named in the accounts. So when Mrs. Lib Powys visited Fonthill House in 1776, so that's 6 years after the alderman has died, she writes, "There are many good pictures and very many indifferent. Casali's I never admire. The best at Fonthill are of the small kind, fit only for ladies' cabinets. Of these, there are many capital ones." And this is that difference between the easel painting and the decorative ceiling painting. And the two that are on loan here, which were originally from a set of 4, are examples of these kind of smaller kind of cabinet, not quite cabinet pictures, they would be much, much smaller. But these are the sort of things that you can imagine a set of the seasons hanging in a lady's bedchamber. These are the ones that she admired more than the indifferent big history paintings. So yes, the two on loan from the Holborn Museum, originally clearly from a set of 4 depicting the 4 seasons, 2 of which were purchased by Sir William Holborn. And what's really frustrating is there is no clear description of them in any of these sources that I've referred to. There is no catalogue entry that says 4 pictures depicting the seasons. That would be too easy. Or, well, there is none that I have yet found. And the problem with this is that Fonthill House is frustratingly hard to research. Because there is very little personal archive for Alderman Beckford. There is reams of archives for William Thomas Beckford, but there is very little personal archive for Alderman Beckford. There is political archive. There are a handful of things, and there are other people's accounts, particularly of people that visited, like the Shelburnes visiting from Bowood, and other people that are visiting, but there is very scant personal detail. Possibly, his son got rid of quite a lot of it. And that's really frustrating because it means, you know, we have little evidence other than kind of these descriptions to work from. And they are not in the 1801 or the 1807 sale catalogue for Fonthill House. They are also not in any of the Bath catalogues. But in those catalogues, there are quite a few ditto by ditto. So, you know, a painting by Casali, and then the next lot will be ditto by ditto. So, you know, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. But and as yet, there must have been more Casalis in the house than I've been able to find references for in any of those sources. So, you know, there is still the possibility that we might find a bit more about them. Holborn called them summer and autumn. And in 1867, they are listed in his study in the catalogue of his house. So we have spring that depicts flora. And you might see it if you flash your torch on it. In the corners of the pictures, they have the signs of the zodiac. So spring has Aries, Taurus, and Gemini. And summer, or Ceres, as it's sometimes referred to, has Cancer, Leo, and Virgo. And this naming, summer or autumn, is a huge cause of confusion, because actually it might be autumn. And in some catalogues it's autumn, some catalogues it's summer. So to add to that confusion, they are attributed to Casali in the 1867 catalogue, and by 1927 they've been reattributed to J.J. Legrand. And in 1976, they're reattributed back to Casali. So they've had an interesting kind of a provenance story. There is an autumn that could be from the same set, but doesn't have those signs of the zodiac. And one reference is that, you know, possibly those signs of the zodiac have been overpainted later. Possibly not. So there is an autumn at Temple Newsome that has been attributed to Casali, but it's also of Ceres, which would make the Holborn one not part of the pair, or not part of the 4 for the Holborn one. So it might be from a separate set. And there's a really interesting reference in the Temple Newsome catalogue to it having been a set of overdoors for Fonthill. And I have no idea where they got that from. So, and I have not been able to find that reference. There are references to overdoors, but not by Casali. So the 1801 sale lists 12 Casalis in the picture gallery, and that is the room marked H in the red box. One of the most important spaces in the house, including one that the Alderman purchased directly from Casali's sale in 1766 before Casali returned to Italy. And he bought quite a few things in that sale. So he bought lot 100 and, here we go. This is the 1801. So 1801, we know the 12 Casalis, and in 1801, this is what John Britton says. Notwithstanding the furniture, it is an antiquated and far from pure taste, and that some gaudy paintings by Casali continue to usurp the place, which I hope will soon be filled with the works of our first-rate modern masters. Bear in mind, this is 1801. He's also trying to carry favour with the younger William Beckford, so who he knows doesn't like his father's stuff and is already starting to think about selling it all off. So yes, the gaudy paintings by Casali is what we're now looking at for the picture gallery. And in 1766, he buys lot 197, which is Edward Martyr being stabbed in the back in the presence of Alfredo at Corfe Castle, now at Burton Constable. And he also buys its pair, Gunhilda, lot 198. He also buys 199, Pygmalion, lot 200, Alexander and his mistress, which hung over the chimney. Sorry, he didn't buy these. These are the lots in 1801. Alexander and his mistress hung over the chimney in the picture gallery. He also had Susanna and the two elders and Cleopatra in the picture gallery by Casali. And then here we get one of those two ditto, so history paintings, two ditto by ditto. So it's just listing the Casalis. But most importantly for the picture gallery is lot 196 in 1801. And lot 196 in 1801 sale, and this is the younger William Beckford in 1801 selling the contents of his father's house. Lot 196 is 5 history pictures by Casali on the ceiling. Through a process of elimination, those are the history paintings depicting the arts and sciences that now hang at Durham Park. And here they are, all 5 of them, and to go through them, we have Mercury and Minerva presiding over the arts. And what you've got to remember is the scale of that room. So the scale of the picture gallery was that it was 73 foot long, so 23.3 meters, 24 foot wide, so about 7.3 meters. And not quite double height, but would have been made to feel quite tall because it was sort of quite narrow. So 2 of the large pictures, Minerva and Mercury, and then Immortality presiding over the arts. And then 3 companion pictures, the personifications of music and painting, history and time, and most importantly, architecture, astronomy and architecture. And we have descriptions of this space. So this is a really important space in terms of a public space. You've got to remember, staterooms in these country houses are like public spaces. So the public space, this is Alderman Beckford's museum to himself. It's his picture gallery. And we have descriptions of it. And we have to kind of think about how they would have been laid out. And this is where I still have a bit more work to do on decorative ceiling paintings, in terms of what the logical kind of layout of it in that space would have been. So the description, we have it from Lady Shelburne, so who's come over from Bowood to see the Alderman Beckford, and more importantly to see Mrs. Beckford, who she was very good friends with. In the middle of one side of the room is a white marble statue of Mr. Beckford when Lord Mayor. The furniture is just put up, the gilding all new and bright, and the ceilings being painted by Casali give the whole a magnificent and brilliant appearance. And if it can impress the Bowoods, you know, if it can impress Shelburne, then this is an impressive space. And the statue is this, John Francis Moore's marble statue of Alderman Beckford, which is now in Iron Hall, Ironmonger's Hall. And the Alderman had commissioned of himself and placed in that gallery. This is where it becomes really interesting in terms of that idea of kind of image making or myth making. Because if we go back to one of those paintings, the personification of astronomy and architecture, architecture is holding in their hand a drawing of Fonthill House. So this is like the Alderman saying, you know, architecture can be summed up in one building, and that's my house. So there's something really kind of powerful in this image making about like my presence, my strength, my importance, my ownership. You know, you can personify the whole of architecture into this one building, and I built it. And then what I'm going to do is put a statue of myself underneath it to really, really kind of hammer home this idea of, you know exactly whose house you're in when you're in this space, and you know exactly how powerful he is, and you cannot escape him. And his son escapes him by knocking this house down, but takes the statue of his father and puts it in his own entrance hall at Fonthill Abbey to peer over anyone coming in. So he can never quite get out from his father's shadow. But he absolutely is going to sweep away his father's taste, that gaudiness, that old-fashionedness, when he then starts thinking about building his own collection and his own building. And from, the first thing that we know that Beckford writes, that he publishes, biographical memoirs of extraordinary painters. It's a play on Vasari's Lives of the Painters. He makes up painters and he gives it a myth. He gives it a tale. He says it's the stories, the fake stories or the mistaken stories he hears the housekeeper telling visitors to Fonthill. So he's surrounded by his father's collection, and it must have had an influence on him. And it definitely had an influence on his aesthetic development, even if that influence was actually him realizing what he didn't like and what he was going to collect when he starts building his own building, which necessitates the demolition of Fonthill House. And he says that he's demolishing Fonthill House because it's too damp, because it's too close to the river. And this is what precipitates the 1801 sale. And then in 1807, he demolishes the rest of the house and actually sells the building material in an auction that we have the catalogue for. And at that time, in 1807, he writes to his son-in-law, who's the future Duke of Hamilton, "We are in the midst of all the fracas and dust of demolition on the one hand and building on the other. You will forget the old palace of tertian fevers, with all its false Greek and fake Egyptian, its small doors and mean ornaments, its Dorberries a la Casali." And that sums up William Beckford's opinion of Casali. It's Dorberries a la Casali. So he is selling them all. And like I said, in 1801, he sells 20 pictures by Casali. And in the 1801 sale, 11 lots are purchased by Mr. Evil for William Wyatt Diamond of the Theatre Royal in Bath. And we know this, there's an annotated sale catalogue at the Wallace collection that lists Evil is buying them and who he's buying them for, because Evil is he's an upholsterer, he's a dealer, he's buying for other people in Bath as well. And of those lots that he is buying for William Wyatt Diamond, it includes, you can't quite see the top, but it includes the state bed that William Thomas Beckford, so the younger Beckford, had designed by Sir John Soane for Fonthill House. And this is Soane's drawing of it in the Beckford papers in the Bodleian. And the beady-eyed amongst you, although those of you that know Beckford's Tower will obviously recognise that the top of design of this bed is also what the top of Beckford's Tower represents, which is the Karagic monument of Lysikrates in Athens. And this was a huge bed. And Evil also buys a lot of the lots around it. So he buys 11 lots. And he buys the furniture for this room, some of the other furniture. He buys the carpets, he buys the curtains from this room, presumably moving it all to his house here in Bath, which was on Albion Place on Upper Bristol Road, of which there is now no record. So, this bed came to Bath and we don't know where it then went. But of those 11 lots, Diamond also purchased lot 115, which was Diana by Casali from the State Dressing Room, who we encountered earlier, and lot 196, 5 historical paintings for 13 guineas. And he buys them at the exact time when they are starting to work on the enlargement of the Theatre Royal. And working with George Dance, the architect, who from 1803 to 1805 is working on the Theatre Royal. And Dance being involved with Soane being the designer of that bed. There's lots of kind of links. And he purchases them and instructs, or there are designs by Dance then in the Soane Museum collection for the placement of those paintings in the ceiling of the Theatre Royal in Bath. And that's this drawing here. So the idea that there is a central rotunda The ceiling has this sort of slight dome to it. And the 5 paintings are arranged in kind of a pair of 2 and then the set of 3. And that's what they would have looked like when you lay the actual paintings that are now at Durham Park in their exact location according to that design. So they were at the Theatre Royal until they were removed in 1839. And by all accounts, absolutely filthy because of all the gaslight, you know, when the gaslighting came in and all the kind of like stuff that was happening in the theatre. So they were removed in 1839 and they were put into store. Then they were sold to someone else and put into a different store. Sorry, no, then they were moved into a different store. Someone else's store, and then sold in 1845 and purchased by Colonel Blathwaite for dirham. There is a myth about them having come to Durham through the Methuen of Corsham. That's a kind of myth that comes from Egan's walks around Bath in 1817, which mistakenly says, you know, that's how they came. They came through the Methuens at Corsham. They didn't. They were directly purchased. And at Durham, they have letters that account for that. So they were purchased for Durham, which is where they now are. And then thanks to the recent work that they've done at Durham, the recent interiors project, you can now actually see them. You can't see them, but they're impossible to photograph because of the lighting that's been introduced to Durham. You know, this really brilliantly effective, quite subtle lighting that they've introduced into Durham. So the 3 kind of pendant pieces are all incorporated into one ceiling. And then the other 2 are above stairs. And that's really important because if you want to understand these Casali ceiling paintings, you have to look at them like this. So you have to kind of be looking at them from below to get that idea of the perspective of the canvas in terms of where the figures are placed and where they're kind of looking and the structure of the picture. So here they are in their kind of natural habitat in a way at Durham. So that then brings us to room E on the principal floor of Fonthill, the Great Dining Room. And in 1768, Maria Marsh, Alderman Beckford's stepdaughter, Maria Beckford, says the feast in the Great Dining Room, the feast of the gods is very finely painted on the ceiling, and also Ceres, Pan, Pomona, and Morpheus in each corner ovals. And over the chimney piece, you have Apollo and Diana. And in the 1801 sale, these are lot 99, 5 historical paintings on the ceiling, which go for 40 guineas. And this is really interesting because they go for 40 guineas as opposed to the Durham ones, which went for 13, which is whoever wanted, the person buying them really wanted them. Because they went for a much, much higher price. And the person buying them was buying them for a country house in Dorset, as well as a fireplace from Fonthill House. So they also purchased a fireplace from Fonthill House. And thanks to David, we can show you a painting of the centerpiece of those 5 paintings, the Feast of the Gods. What's also interesting is at one point in this room, there were Casali portraits of Maria Beckford says, sorry, not Maria Beckford, Elizabeth Beckford, Beckford's stepdaughter, says there are portraits by Casali of her mother and father and of her uncle, I think one of her uncles, which doesn't say by Casali, but the way that it's written suggests they are also by Casali. So it's possible that there were 4 more Beckford family portraits by Casali, as well as that one of the young William Beckford at 6 years old that we have no trace of, frustratingly, in the same space. So here we have the Feast of the Gods, still lives in where it was intended to be seen, which is in a ceiling that was acquired for the house in Dorset and put in store while the work was being done on that house. And then the 4 companion ovals, or each corner oval, were never installed. And they were then purchased for £3 each for the new institution building in Bath in 1823 by Hastings Elwyn. And look above you. So there they are, as described by Maria Beckford's stepdaughter, so William Thomas Beckford's stepsister, half-sister. The Feast of the Gods is very finely painted on the ceiling, and also Ceres, Pan, Pomona, and Morpheus in each corner oval. And frustratingly, I mean, what's really interesting is they're not listed by name in the sale catalogue, but because we have that written account, we can match them together because we know what room they were in. And that's one of the most exciting things about trying to piece these stories together, is you get the sale catalogue and you've got those lists, and then you read one account and there's nothing, and you read another account and it talks about, you know, ceiling painting by Beaulieu, and you're like, no, I don't want him. And then, you know, you scrabble around and then you find another one and it says, oh, state dressing room, Feast of the Gods, or state dining room, Feast of the Gods. And you're like, okay, brilliant, match those 2 things up. And there are still probably accounts that have not yet been found of visits to Fonthill House, because they will be someone's personal diary that will be in an archive somewhere. So while I was researching, we wrote a book on Fonthill in 2018, and I did a chapter on Fonthill House. And while I was researching that, I was looking at something completely different in the Wiltshire Record Office. And came across a reference to this travel journal that talked about Witham Friary, which is an estate that Beckford also owned, that ironically I'm doing a talk about in 2 weeks. But and I thought, oh great, I'll look that up because it talks about Witham. And actually it didn't just talk about Witham, it also had a long, extensive description of Fonthill House as well. So, you know, these are diaries that we don't know about because people have been looking in them for a specific thing, or they've been catalogued under certain things. More often than not, quite tragically, it's women's writing because they have not been researched as much, and they've been dismissed more as like domestic journal writings, which actually are probably full of an incredible wealth of information. So I'm sure there is more, and I'm sure at some point we may come across something that talks about these pictures. But then we get into the thing of, okay, how were they arranged in that great dining room? And you've got to remember what that dining room functioned for. It's quite possibly the most important room in the house in terms of image making, in terms of impressing your guests. Because anyone that you are inviting for a country house party or a country house visit, you are entertaining them here. They are your captive audience. And you, the head of the household, are going to be sat at the head of that table. So if you think, if we're looking at the bottom of the picture, in the center is a fireplace, and either side, those openings are the entrances into the room. So you're going in at either side. The apse, the niche that you can see on the far left, that's where like one of the serving tables would have been. So if you think of the table, is this a flasher? Yes. If you think of the dining table being here, you've got the head of the table there and the foot of the table there. So is it arranged so that you come in and it's orientated when you look up? Or is it arranged, and the corners like that on the same orientation? Or is it arranged so that the corners are coming out from the centerpiece? Or is it arranged so the orientation is as you are looking up to the head of the table and who is sitting at the head of the table? You know, the gods, the feast of the gods, with the principal gods being at the center, and then you look beyond them and at the head of the table, you've got the Beckfords. So that whole, you know, and this is where this kind of decorative painting is really important, because it's also about the function of the room. And yes, they're pictures, but they're part of the interior design. They're part of the interior architecture, particularly ones like these, because they were commissioned expressly for a house that was being built. So they're part of that, the genesis of that kind of design process. And it makes these like really fundamental to part of that idea of the creation of image, the creation of social identity, the expression of power that this family were doing, the wealth that they could show. And, you know, of course, in the dining room, you're going to have feasting, that allegorical connection between the decorative scheme and the function of the room. But it's kind of like placing your hosts. You know, you're feasting with the gods when you're coming and eating with this family, because that is the position of power that they believe they have, that a lot of people perceive that they have. And that's the position of power that this utterly obscene wealth that colonialism was creating, was allowing and was creating, that level of, that position of privilege that wealth enabled, which then enabled the commissioning of all of these pictures. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Amy. I don't know what to say. As always, you knock us sideways with your knowledge and your presentation, and it's just wonderful to have had you share it with us. And I have to say, oops, we have always called the one on the right Mercury, and it's Morpheus. Ooh.
Well, I mean,
anyway, we will learn.
Beckford's half sister knew what she was talking about.
But
I think she probably did.
She probably had a better insight than we do. Anyway, I've been entranced. I've been interested in Beckford for a long time, and interested in these paintings for a long time too. So thank you very much for bringing it all together. I would just like to mention that it's our bicentenary, and we had a president in 1824 who was the Marquis of Lansdowne. And his grandfather was the Lord Shelburne that Amy has been mentioning as dining probably beneath these paintings. So another little connection for us. Would anybody in the room like to ask any questions? And if there's anybody online who would like to ask a question and would put it in the chat room, we can share it as well. And we'll pass microphones round because people are online and would like to know what you're asking.
Where did you say, or didn't you say where the Feast of the Gods is now? What's it?
It's in a private house in Dorset.
I see. And my other question is this talk going to be published? Is your talk going to be published? Because there's a lot of, so much information in this.
If I ever get round to writing it up, that's why the recording is probably quite important. So I'm terrible at actually writing any of my research up. I'm too busy fixing leaky roofs.
We expect to be able to put this onto the Brilsey YouTube channel within the next 4 weeks.
I would like, firstly, I would like to thank the fact that we've had an afternoon lecture, which is much easier to get to. But I would like to know about whether you think the orientation of these paintings is now correct, because for me,
Controversial.
it's not.
It's really hard, isn't it? Because it kind of depends on how you think they would have been in the house. I mean, this is my next bit of research really, is looking at, well, trying to find other Casali decorative schemes that still exist, because that will give you an idea of how he laid out a ceiling. And then, I mean, frustratingly, we don't know the architect of Fonthill House, because that also would have helped us in terms of the idea of how ceilings were designed. And then get more of a feel really. And what I don't have, so what I did have for Durham is I had all the dimensions. So I spent like 3 hours trying to work out the dimensions of all the Durham paintings to scale in the dimension of the floor plan. And then I just gave up because I'm not an architect. And I really don't understand Photoshop. But that I'd quite like to do with this is to get the dimensions of them and put them into the dimensions of that dining room. because that would then give us a sense of the arrangement, but also where the plasterwork. So obviously, because what he would have also done is had one of the leading stuccatori artists or plasterwork artists who would have been doing all the ovals, all the roundels, all the decorative kind of framing of all the pictures. And this is where the frustration with the lack of the Alderman evidence is, because in a lot of other places there'll be an account book. And you'll be able to see who was getting paid. And all we have for Alderman Beckford is there's actually a list in the testimony after his will that lists payments that haven't been made yet that are owed. And that's how we, you know, there's like 2 chairs by Chippendale or something. Nothing for Casali, unfortunately. But so I don't know really. I mean, obviously the Feast of the Gods would have been in the middle. And then it depends on kind of that idea of orientation. If would they have been straight? Would they have been angled? Do you run the risk of getting kind of like seduced by the curves of the canvas and imagining that they all fit together? I mean, one of the first versions I had them all kind of tucked next to each other. And then you actually think, no, there would have been plaster. There would have been plaster between in the middle. So that's a really easy way of saying I don't want to get involved in the debate about the orientation of the paintings in the ceiling. But I think it's interesting the way that they're recorded by in that sequence. So Ceres, Pan, Pomona, Morpheus, which suggests the natural suggestion would be that that's someone looking up and going clockwise. But then, you know, there's no kind of proof of that. What's really interesting is that a lot of the Casali ceiling painting, or some of the Casali ceiling painting frames for the Alderman were actually papier-mâché. So they weren't carved timber, they were gilded papier-mâché. And I mean, huge paintings. So I mean, Beckford just cleared them all out. The younger Beckford just cleared them all out. And the ceilings themselves were sold. So part of the plasterwork was sold in the 1807 building materials sale catalogue. It lists plasterwork.
Can I just make a quick correction of what I said earlier? Apparently our first president was the son of the Shelburne that we've been talking about. And I know this is true because it comes from someone who worked in the archives at Bowood.
I'm just misunderstood it. How I link in.
Oh, so
And Casali.
yeah, so the William Beckford who built Fonthill House is the William Beckford who built Beckford's Tower's father. And he inherits Fonthill House. He inherits all of these paintings when he inherits his father's property, and lives in that house until 1801. And in 1801, he starts stripping out its contents. And in 1807, he demolishes it. And he uses the funds, he uses all these guineas that he's getting from selling all these pictures to continue building Fonthill Abbey on the same estate. And then in 1823, he sells Fonthill Abbey and he moves to Bath. So comes to Bath in 1822. And lives on Lansdowne Crescent from 1823 until he dies in 1844. So some of the profits of selling Fonthill is what then pays for the building of the building in Bath.
Somebody at the back, thank you.
I just wondered, are any of Casali's patrons, as it were, not English? And also what happened to him when he left England?
We know less about the latter. Sorry, excuse me. Less about the latter question. So he leaves in 1766. He dies in 1784. And there's less documentation of what he then does, which suggests he's not active. That he's not painting as much when he goes back to Italy. I mean, he would have gone back with a relative amount of wealth for an artisan. And yes, I mean, a lot of the Italian patrons is the church. He does something he's in Prussia. I'm trying to remember the date. He's in Prussia and then Holland in, I think, the mid 1740s, and he's actually made a kind of like a chevalier in Prussia, and given wealth. There's a description of him that talks of him being an impressive figure with jewels, which is possibly the jewels he was given when in Prussia. There's one other description of him, which I forgot to say, but there's one other description of him that says, sorry, it says that he was an ingenious and well-behaved man. So yes, he had some European patrons, but nothing kind of more substantial than those kind of key ones, that Prussia one. His bread and butter was the English. And you know, the English that were putting together, you know, what we would call really a typical country house collection. It's not a collection that's going to set the world on fire, Alderman Beckford's collection, although there are flashes of it, flourishes of it that show actually very forethought taste, like Hogarth, you know, the collecting of those Hogarths, but that's also, he could afford them. Yeah, I think, you know, once he makes those connections in Italy with the grand tourists, he clocks that they've got money to burn.
There's a question at the back.
I just have a practical question. I was just struck that properties in the past, or is it just this properties, seem to be sold off and repurposed? Is that the norm amongst stately homes?
Yeah. There was a really roaring trade in rooms. Either because you're stripping out a room because you're redecorating, and you would sell a room, and normally it's about who you're working with or what architect is working on it. So for example, when Beckford is clearing out the contents of Fonthill in 1801, and then in 1807 the building materials, James Wyatt is working for him, having done some alterations to Fonthill House and building Fonthill Abbey at the exact same time as he's building Doddington Park. So he knows that this big staircase is coming out of Fonthill House, the blue staircase, and he knows that he needs an impressive staircase for Doddington Park. So he goes to the Codringtons, this amount of money, you can buy Beckford's staircase, and they buy it and they move it to Doddington Park. So the staircase at Doddington is from Fonthill House. So there's this kind of real trade in building material, and you can get a lot of money for building material. The 1807 sale catalogue of building materials is bigger than the sale catalogue of the contents. Because it's everything: roof timbers, plaster panels, wall hangings, skirtings, because it's expensive material. And if you're buying them from a country house, you can cut them down to size. So you get whole rooms being bought either because they're being redone or modernized. Often it's because they're being modernized, or because the house is being demolished. And there's a trade in that in like the 18th century into the 19th century. And then the trade in that then massively resurfaces in the early 20th century. And there's a really, really good book by someone called John Harris, who was like the god of architectural history in Britain. And it's about trading rooms, and it's about the dealing that was done. And in the early 20th century, it's to America. And it's why there is so much British decorative interior art in America, because the Americans were buying whole rooms from country houses that were being demolished, and particularly from the kind of post First World War period. And that idea of dealing, and it's what an upholsterer was. So if you look in the Bath Chronicle from the Georgian period, you see upholsterer, and an upholsterer is providing everything. He's fitting out a room. So you would go to or your agent would go to the upholsterer's warehouse, and you'd be picking curtains, carpets, furniture, paintings, plasterwork, doors, door furniture. And that's what Evil is doing a little bit of that. But yeah, it was quite common.
And just one last question. How did they actually transport these big paintings without damaging them?
Well,
Just had
with
carriages.
probably a lot less care than we now use today. Yeah, they would have wrapped them up, put them on a carriage, probably braced them made a little kind of scaffold and braced them, or taken them off the stretcher and rolled up the canvas. And then re-stretched them in a new location, which was probably the more easier way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, we've just had 21 paintings from living artists delivered to #1 Royal Crescent. And the way that some art movers move things as to how a curator or very good art movers move things is interesting. And I hate to tell you that I've just moved 4 Gainsboroughs in the back of my car. But I have just moved 4 Gainsboroughs in the back of my car. So
There's a certain chairman of the institution would like to ask a question. Before he does, can I just say that these 4 paintings were in storage for about 20 years and not put up. That's why they were bought quite cheaply. So £3 each, £12, including cartage.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, Amy. That's been fantastic and really informative. I want to link together 2 bits of your narrative. The one is that these are seen as old-fashioned by the early 19th century. And the second is that the 2 sets you've talked about end up in shall I say, institutional homes. So the institution in its old building on Terrace Walk, and you mentioned the Theatre Royal. And I wondered whether there was anything to be said about the kind of politics of taste and how taste had changed, that these are bought as sets not for families, but for institutions that perhaps Theatre Royal is slightly different, but for the institution that then becomes our institution, this is a very new institution, but wanting obviously to establish itself as something really important. So I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that.
yeah, it's true. I mean, you know, the institution building was quite a modern building. I mean, particularly when the new portico, you know, when Wilkins puts on the new portico, that's incredibly modern at that time. And you know, they could have been going to a contemporary painter. You've got fewer people that can do ceiling paintings. I mean, you've got people that can do canvas ceiling paintings. You've got fewer people that can do like painted plasterwork or kind of paintings at that time. And I guess there's an element of they're cheap. So I'm sure that probably kind of played a big part. But I think it's also probably the subject matter. So, you know, for something like the institution, which is being designed as this like temple, at the time of the Greek revival, at the time of that idea of you adopt the kind of outward expression of a Greek temple, or because they are like temples of learning, temples of knowledge, all the kind of meaning that this architectural style kind of adopts, you would want classical subjects to fill that space. And, you know, ideally you'd want the pictures at Durham. I mean, they must have been like, oh, I want those ones that are at, like, you know, the ones at that then Theatre Royal would have been perfect because of what they showed. But as long as they're kind of allegorical, as long as they fit within that kind of idea of classicism, they would have fit with the kind of identity that kind of temple of knowledge would have been wanting to project. And I mean, you are getting painters that are doing this sort of thing at that time, but it's not him. You know, the painters that are really, really cutting edge, the institution wouldn't have been able to afford, or they haven't yet been kind of like acknowledged or accepted. They're not yet seen as kind of the level of quality that they actually were. So it's an interesting thing about that idea of taste, because also Bath is slightly out of fashion. I mean, Bath in the 1820s is out a bit old-fashioned. And that's why things like, you know, Wilkins coming in and putting that portico on is so different, because it's such a modern piece of architecture. That's why, you know, Beckford's Tower was so different, because it was such a modern piece of architecture compared to really a city that's still dealing with the hangover of, in a way, Palladianism. So I think it's quite illustrative of Bath being a little bit kind of over. But fantastic opportunity. I mean, £3. You know, they were like, 12 quid. You couldn't have even commissioned an artist to do, think of the artists that are painting at that time, Benjamin Barker, Thomas Barker. There's absolutely no way you could have got, these sort of things done. So I'd love to see the other side of them. I went to see them in the conservation studio when they were being conserved 15 years ago, but never saw the back of them.
Michael, please.
Amy, I think, isn't there a photograph of them in the ceiling at Terrace Walk?
Yes,
And I think that was in the museum, wasn't it? Maybe they were looked upon as museum pieces.
Museum pieces. Well, actually, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they could have been seen as actually being the art collection for the institution, rather than the decorative, decorative features. I know I don't have a copy of that picture, and I know. I meant to email and ask for it, but I was putting this together this morning, so I didn't have time.
Somebody down here was waving. No. Okay. Well, look, it has been a fascinating afternoon. I know many of the people in the room here have a link with Casali's in one form or another, and we all wanted to know more about him and his work and his context, and you've done a fantastic job in doing that for us. So can we just say thank you very much to Amy once again.